Ladies and gentlemen, COVID time is hard for everyone, but for some it is harder than others. We are in the same storm, but not in the same boat. The starting situation is already different. Children with disabilities already have a problem. The living conditions as a result of COVID-19 made it even harder, not only for the children themselves, but for their parents and all those who care for them voluntarily and professionally. When it comes to poorer families, the situation is even harsher. A lot of creativity, innovation, resilience, and solidarity has been shown by many to make the best of it. This is also the case for social services for all people with disabilities. All attention has rightly been and continues to be focused on those most physically affected by the disease and most likely to even die. There are almost 500,000 deadly casualties in Europe, 500,000. But that does not alter the fact that fate also struck elsewhere, mentally and in other ways. The European Union as an institution has almost no competence in the social sphere unless it is supplementary and coordinating. The European Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission proclaimed the European Pillar of Social Rights in 2017. It consists of 20 principles that have guided us ever since towards a strong social Europe. Its implementation depends very much on the cooperation of the member states. Nevertheless, it was an important step. A new strategy for the rights of persons with disabilities 2021-2030 aims at enforcing their right to take part in all areas of life, just like everyone else. The Commission has just launched a proposal for a new child guarantee where member states will have to launch action plans to help bring children out of poverty. There is a particular emphasis on children with disabilities and access to childcare, inclusive education and health. Although the European Union is not really competent, it reacted relatively quickly by setting up a funding mechanism to support the sector. But these funds have still not reached the sector. Often the member state level turns out to be the bottleneck. In general, solidarity is a crucial value for the Union, and the corona crisis showed this once more. The European Recovery Fund is a real breakthrough because it involves a huge amount of money, 750 billion euros, 390 of which are donations, non-refundable gifts, and because the target group is those countries and regions most affected by the pandemic. Negotiating this was difficult, precisely because it involved solidarity. Another example is the European procurement for vaccines. The intention here is that every member state, large and small, should have equal access to vaccines. After all, smaller countries have a weaker negotiating position compared to the giant pharmaceutical companies. We can already see today how the EU itself is being treated by some of these firms. Solidarity on vaccines is important for the sake of the integrity of the single market and the level playing field. If all member states come out of the crisis together, they strengthen each other and the economic impulse is all the stronger. Solidarity is also called for in the resettlement of asylum seekers and refugees across all countries of the European Union. This is another very difficult exercise, given the great political sensitivity of migration at national level. The Commission is making every effort to reach a compromise in the end. Ladies and gentlemen, within the member states themselves, fighting inequalities is again high on the political agenda because these have been increasing in recent decades, albeit to a much lesser extent than, for example, in the United States. COVID brings new inequalities on top of existing ones. Let me mention two of them. Poor people tend to live 6 years less than wealthier people, 6 years. For many reasons, poor people are more affected by the pandemic. Another example, the closure of schools during lockdowns can increase inequality. In the Netherlands, according to the International Monetary Fund, pupils in primary education lag behind by 1/5 of a year. The damage to children from socially disadvantaged families was greater. Not everyone can protect themselves from the pandemic in the same way. Remember the lack of mouth masks at the beginning of the first lockdown. The lack of protective equipment, unsupported services due to illness, people who have to spend days without care or food, these are all painful stories that occurred in member states. Elderly people in nursing homes were much more exposed than others, especially those living in large units. People who cannot telework are more vulnerable than those who can work from home. Families with a garden experienced a more bearable period than those who have to work remotely with children in a flat. The list is long. I'm not even talking about those who lost their jobs or lost their lives. While governments have taken unprecedented measures to safeguard employment, curb the rise in unemployment successfully, by the way, in 2020, successfully to protect purchasing power, in Belgium it even increased slightly, and successfully to avoid bankruptcies at the expense of the budget, some inequalities were painful in the short term. The consequences of this for the future and for future generations must not be underestimated. This crisis has also shown how important health is, both physical and mental. Today, social services already represent 5% of the working population, or 11 million people. And together with the pure health sector, hospitals, these services employ over 11% of the workforce in the European Union. And the increase here over the last 10 years has been 24%. The aging of the population will further reinforce this trend. The contribution of millions of volunteers across Europe can also not be ignored, especially from the perspective of social cohesion. And indeed, also professionals should be better recognized and valued for their contribution to society. These citizens dedicate their careers to help others live better lives. When I see how people in the US have to fight to get the right to affordable care, I realize what a head start we in Europe have in terms of humanity. But in the past decade, healthcare has sometimes been blindly economized on, with the consequences that entails today. One of the most important benchmarks for the corona policy was and is the capacity of hospitals, and especially intensive care units. Today, it is feared that this scenario of austerity will be repeated once the pandemic is over, and efforts must be made to reduce the budget deficits. However, it is not about less money, but more money. The economic and social impact of this crisis is also expected to lead to higher demand for social services than prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, in this new recovery fund, the European Union should not only consider the digital and ecological transformation, but also the social and human capital. I repeat, the pandemic has shown the importance of collective goods for all, but especially for the most vulnerable. Healthcare and education are critical arteries for our society. And both types of expenditure are as large as 15% of GDP. In general, the role of government and the role of politics has proved crucial. Life and death depend on the quality of policies. I reiterate that there were already major problems before 2020. The staff shortages that exist across the European Union, the funding gap in most, if not all countries, and the waiting lists or inadequate services that still exist even in the most effective systems. If there is a link between climate change and pandemics, this does not bode well. We were totally unprepared for the first wave, and we did not learn enough lessons from the subsequent waves. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the US top infectious disease expert, has said the country shouldn't expect to reach herd immunity, whereby a disease effectively stops traveling freely between infected people, so until at least 75% of Americans are vaccinated. We must learn all the lessons from what we have experienced and are still experiencing, including at global level, especially in poorer countries with less medical infrastructure, hygiene, and vaccines. 95 million people will have fallen into extreme poverty by 2020. Only 0.5% of vaccine doses have been administered in low-income countries. One of these lessons is that health is a broad concept that includes mental, spiritual, and social dimensions, in addition to physical ones. It is a fact that this non-material well-being has also deteriorated in the families of children with disabilities. In general, these four components interact. And another area of coordination is between hospitals, nursing homes, and community care. Care for the elderly must remain affordable, manageable, but also humane. We need to rethink how we support the elderly. And there is, of course, not just one single social services ecosystem in Europe. However, all require further strengthening and improvement. The European Union needs to play a stronger role in the development of social services ecosystems, for instance, in funding, policy guidance, monitoring of progress, support to social dialogue and legislation where appropriate. Such EU action is crucial if it is to strengthen social convergence, social cohesion and resilience across Europe, and to ensure the European pillar of social rights becomes a reality irrespective of where one lives. I hope that the conference on the future of Europe, which starts on May 9th, will pay sufficient attention to the competencies that be in the field of health. The focus of the conference is consulting the citizens, and I'm convinced that the people themselves will make this clear to the leaders, although, of course, the current difficulties with the vaccination may put a damper on the pursuit of more Europe in health matters, and hopefully the vaccination, will be rectified in the coming months. Globalization, ladies and gentlemen, is a phenomenon that goes far beyond the economy or the internet. We have become incredibly interdependent. There is also the globalization of disease, the globalization of health. It's a pity that there is less global governance. The US even withdrew from the World Health Organization in the midst of the crisis. Vaccine nationalism, which cannot be blamed on the EU as the largest exporter, 80 million vaccine doses of which 13 million to the UK, or vaccine diplomacy for nationalist purposes, and therefore not as a donor to COVAX, the global program for the distribution of vaccines. All these demonstrate the lack of real solidarity. However, let us keep everything in perspective. Compared to the rest of the world, the European countries and the EU member states are still doing well in terms of well-being. In the ranking of happiness, 6 EU member states and 9 European countries are among the first 10 countries. The aim of the policy remains to give people a good life. I would add a better life. And that must continue to be our goal, doing better and better. The meliorism, the Romans would say. That is why you are working for. And I pay tribute to the European Academy for Childhood Disability for your important work and your dedication. Thank you so much.